It was just a huge dust cloud and explosion after explosion after explosion, and you knew that nothing good was happening up there.
The attack began with a burst of machine gun fire, followed by around 20 rocket-propelled grenades. Over the next few hours, a platoon of 48 American soldiers and 24 of their Afghan partners fought for their lives against a wave of 200 Taliban fighters. The insurgents advanced mercilessly against a base in the heart of the mountains. Determined to finish off its occupants, they sought to take advantage of the numerical difference in their firepower by landing blows without ceasing. In this new video from Military Force, we invite you to learn the story behind the Battle of Wanat, a terrible scene of brutal resistance and desperation, which became one of the deadliest clashes of the Afghan war. If you want to know the surprising result of this very unequal fight, then stay with us and get ready for action, because here we come.
RPGs, hand grenades, machine gun fire that we were receiving, it seemed like there was no lull in the firefight. It was frustrating for a little while because it felt like they always had fire superiority over us.
This savage battle is part of the fierce war that has been raging in Afghanistan since 2001. The US campaign in that country began with a quick incursion that took the Taliban insurgents by surprise. This group exercised control over a large part of the population, spreading terror everywhere. However, the presence of a powerful rival changed the scenario. The factions that dominated the area were defeated on several fronts and had to retreat to small strongholds. The Americans and their allies established a small number of bases to carry out periodic security missions, seeking to maintain order. But that would not be easy. By 2004, the enemy began to strengthen itself through connections with the Taliban, who had taken refuge in Pakistan, and its influence grew in the border areas with that country. This provoked a response from the American-led coalition, which planned to expand its area of operations into that region. One of the main destinations was the province of Nuristan. By 2007, it had become a frequent threat due to its remote location, with mountainous terrain that was difficult to navigate. In order to counteract this situation, it was proposed to move a military base to the Wanat Valley, one of the hot zones in this fight, where the Americans had connected with the population through the construction of bridges that helped boost the town's economy. In June 2008, after a year of negotiations, a contingent of 72 soldiers made up of 48 Americans and 24 Afghans began operating in the community and its surroundings. They were excited to have achieved this important step in their strategy, but what they did not know was that the enemy was preparing a lethal welcome for them. The US-led coalition wanted the new base to be ready within a few weeks. Their goal was to move the Bela outpost, which operated several kilometers away from this new strategic location. However, on July 4, 2008, problems began. Intelligence reports warned of the presence of a large number of guerrillas ready to attack the forces occupying the facilities. The US troops began to receive a series of mortar attacks that destroyed a large part of the base. In response to the offensive, the US command sent 2 Apache helicopters to follow several trucks fleeing the area. After confirming that the vehicles were driven by insurgents, fire was opened. The attackers were blown up and killed instantly by the powerful missiles of the US aircraft. But this small victory meant nothing. The Taliban were just giving a taste of the bloody battle they were prepared to fight. Just a few days later, the real ambush was ready. The US forces had just landed at their new base and were about to experience a brutal reception. At around 4:20 a.m. on July 13th, the silence was abruptly broken by the ferocious sound of explosions. A massive group of insurgents unleashed a storm of fire on their enemies. Machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars roared in unison at the Americans and their Afghan allies. The initial attack knocked out the base of operations weapons and detonated the ammunition cache. The Taliban then destroyed the Humvee-mounted missile launcher inside the outpost. In short order, the two most powerful weapons in the facility were out of action.
What occurs here is within days we have a full-scale attack. And very quickly they have done an excellent job of scouting out what the camp looked like after just a few days of being built, and they took out all the crew-served weapons.
With the start of that violent attack, the American forces understood how vulnerable their location was. It was just an improvised position on high ground, surrounded by sharp, suffocating mountains that seemed to watch from the shadows. Thanks to the rocks and ravines, any enemy had the perfect cover for a siege. And as if that were not enough, the numerical disadvantage was alarming. The mere 48 soldiers of the 173rd American Airborne Brigade had to face 200 fierce Taliban armed to the teeth. They were trained to face any situation, but without warning, they had found themselves in a true hell. The insurgents continued to fire from elevated positions, taking advantage of the terrain as a relentless hunting ground. Bullets hit rocks and metal like an endless rain of death, while the American soldiers, still stunned by the sudden roar, tried to react and organize a defense. The ferocious enemy had achieved its first objective by neutralizing the only weaponry that could really contain the onslaught. Then, the RPGs began to act on the rest of the base without mercy, blowing up every corner of the rival post, while the troops inside tried to resist as best they could. The Taliban line of fire was incessant. Within minutes, the soldiers operating the machine guns were wounded or dead. The lack of cover and adequate protection left the defenders in a desperate situation, with the enemy advancing from all directions. As the insurgents approached, the fighting became increasingly harsh. The attackers used guerrilla tactics to close the perimeter, pushing the Americans toward the center of the base. Feeling completely trapped, the American troops tried to establish a coordinated firing point, but the wave of enemy bullets gave no respite. The Taliban fired at point-blank range, using grenade launchers and AK-47 assault rifles that spewed fire at a dizzying pace. The soldiers inside the Wanat outpost could not look anywhere without seeing a dead body or a wounded comrade screaming in pain. Desperation increased with each passing minute, and the American response was not enough. All their attempts were violently suppressed by the insurgents, who seemed to emerge from everywhere.
Behind that wall right there! Where at? To the east! To the east! 200 meters! 200 meters!
With the terrain in their favor, the Taliban fired from protected positions and then disappeared, only to reposition and attack from a different angle. The Americans, on the other hand, were out in the open, scrambling for cover behind the few places that had not been destroyed. Several hours had passed when the defenders struggling to survive realized that ammunition was running low. Amid the unbearable heat, the soldiers felt their bodies worn down and their energy stretched thin. Some of them, battered and wounded, were bleeding slowly as they tried to hold their ground. Meanwhile, the insurgents managed to breach the perimeter and advanced even further. As they came closer, hand-to-hand fighting broke out, in desperate combat where rifle butts and hands became weapons. The Americans had been sending out urgent calls for help and requesting air support for a long time, but it never came. The minutes seemed to drag on, and the Taliban did not stop. The violence was constant. The air was filled with dust, smoke, and blood. The wounded lay motionless while their comrades tried to maintain their composure. Firing incessantly, moving at short distances and taking cover behind the few remaining stones. For some, every second of this confrontation was a struggle to stay alive and not succumb to the paralyzing fear of death that stalked them. At one point in the offensive, the insurgents concentrated their attack on a small team located at an observation post. When the battle reached its peak, a figure on the American side took center stage. A projectile flew ferociously until it hit with great precision and wounded all the occupants. But among them, still bleeding, and while a comrade tried to make a tourniquet, Sergeant Ryan Pitts refused to retreat. He knew that this rudimentary position was crucial to the defense of the base, as it was the only place that could offer them an advantage against the advancing enemy fighters that kept coming. Struggling to move because of the grenade fragments that had hit his legs, he kept firing to repel the insurgents who attacked from all corners. The rivals kept appearing, and the situation became even more desperate when his companions at the observation post began to fall one by one. However, that only gave him more impetus to continue pulling the trigger.
There was just this overwhelming sense of duty to each other that superseded, I guess, any sort of interest in self-preservation. Those guys fought to death.
Eventually, Pitts became the only survivor in that bunker high up. Alone and wounded, he knew that if the Taliban captured his position, they would have a tactical advantage to attack Wanat base from a higher altitude. Despite his wounds and excruciating pain, he crawled to collect his remaining ammunition and continued to throw grenades and fire at the enemy. In a resistance that seemed unsustainable. Facing a situation where death seemed inevitable, the sergeant maintained communication with his colleagues and continually reported what he could observe from his position, asking for support and describing the Taliban positions so that the soldiers would know where to shoot. Finally, after almost 4 hours of brutal resistance, air support arrived. Apache helicopters and missile-armed fighter planes began to bomb the enemy positions. After an hour and a half of siege, the insurgents began to flee little by little and abandon the place. However, the devastation had already been done. The battlefield was covered in blood, rubble, and wounded soldiers screaming in pain and mourning their fallen comrades. The Battle of Wanat left 9 American soldiers dead, with another 27 wounded. Meanwhile, Taliban casualties were estimated to include 100 fighters killed.
And basically, at the end of several hours of incredible heroism by this outfit from the 173rd, we lose 9 soldiers, but they have stopped the camp from being overrun.
In this way, only 48 American soldiers had managed to withstand the brutal attack of 200 Taliban. Thanks to the bravery and courage of fighters like Ryan Pitts, the impossible had been achieved. That is why this sergeant was awarded the Medal of Honor and the highest military recognition in the United States. And even his own colleagues have praised his great actions in battle.
You want to protect your brothers in combat. You love them very much. You always want to do that, but it's not an obligation. So he didn't have to stay there. But being the type of person that Ryan is, I couldn't see him doing anything else. It's what he was prepared to give his life to do, and all the other guys, all the 9 guys that we lost, felt the same exact way.
However, beyond the heroism that took place in Wanat, the consequences of the bloody battle were no small thing. Days after the attack, the US Army decided to abandon the base and send additional troops to evacuate it. But that was not all. The events also led to a series of investigations into the actions of the forces that had been surprised by the Taliban. In fact, the chain of command was sanctioned, although in 2010, the reprimands were revoked, and it was assured that there was no negligence. On the contrary, from then on the focus was put on the corruption of the Afghan people who had betrayed them after the negotiations.
When we get up there, we bring in some Afghan commandos led by Special Forces, US Special Forces, as well as a bunch of reinforcements. We find that the whole city or town had been compromised. The police apparently had abandoned their complete site and the enemy used their facility, basically.
Finally, the performance of the American troops was once again seen as an act that exalted the forces of the United States in front of the world. And the fight was not only against a relentless enemy, but against the feeling of abandonment, fear, and the relentless wear and tear of each second under fire. For the soldiers who survived, it meant a test of overcoming and camaraderie. But the battle also left indelible marks and transformed Wanat into a somber reminder of the horrors of the war in Afghanistan. Now, after having learned the history of this brutal confrontation, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We hope to see you again in our next military force video.